Yes, hi, welcome. I'm Hajo Backe. I'm the next ITU speaker here. I think Miguel did a proper, organized a proper peer review, and that is not a sign that we are a club of people. No. So welcome also from me. I'm really happy to be able to speak here. I have asked myself actually how I introduced this talk now. I've been working on games for forever, for my whole academic career by now, and I've dabbled in eco-critical games for a while now as well. And I think if there is a through line in my work, then it's probably that I find myself advocating for taking mainstream games seriously, sort of in the tradition of us reading theater, literature, film, throughout the ages. So, and in that tradition, I want to talk to you today about how the grand strategy game Stellaris allows its players to experience time and space at a scale that challenges our human perception and our human brains, if you will, and how this might be an important learning for our struggle to come to terms with the idea of the Anthropocene. And because I'm talking about very big scales, I have way too many slides and I will majorly read from my presenter notes. That's not something I'm used to do, but bear with me. Yes. So my central theoretical inspiration for all of this is Ursula Hayes' paper, Science Fiction and the Timescales of the Anthropocene. The idea that we as a species are exerting a force on our natural environment that is on the level of geological power is something that we humans struggle to comprehend. And in her paper, Hayes wrote about how literary science fiction offers perspectives that have potential to transcend this limited human scope. Her paper analyzes a whole range of science fiction narratives for the literary devices they employ to make the vast timescales at the core of the Anthropocene more tangible, and for common narrative tropes. Importantly, though, Hayes emphasizes that it is not merely the immeasurably large scale of geological time that stands in the way of our comprehension, it's the clashing of several timescales. She writes, and you cannot really read this, she writes, the Anthropocene challenges us to reconsider what the human means across scales that are not easily compatible with each other. She elaborates this, and I quote, collective human temporality now has to be thought on at least 3 different timescales. On the scale of human history that has generated multiple inequalities between humans, on the scale of a humanity that has become an agent as a species, and on the scale of a geological power that transforms the planet's physical nature, end quote. So it is not only the unimaginable scale of the geological time that stands in our way of comprehending the Anthropocene, it is the need to see it in relation to our own lived experience as humans, with complex relationships among the members of our species, as well as the effects we cause as a whole species without usually being aware of them. This concurrence of these 3 conflicting, incompatible timescales is what makes it so challenging to imagine the Anthropocene. And this is why Hayes asks, if the Anthropocene indeed calls for a scaling up of the imagination, how might that imagination translate into narrative? She seeks to answer that question in the analysis of a sizable corpus of literary science fiction narratives and manages to identify a number of recurring literary devices, as well as a tendency towards stories of large-scale developments that are influenced, yet crucially not controlled by humans, and where the rise of and fall of communities correlates with planetary ecology. And that, to me, has always provoked the question, what can digital games add to this imaginary potential? And what are the ludonarrative devices they would gravitate towards? That question could, of course, be asked with a whole range of games. There are plenty of games that challenge us in terms of the scope that they present and the non-human and more than human perspectives they offer us. But I want to here argue that Stellaris, more than pretty much any other game, juxtaposes precisely those 3 different timescales that Hayes talks about. The individual view on history, the agency of whole species, and the geological power that a species eventually can exert. And the game does that actually by a combination of its rules, its narrative, and above all, the scale of its own simulation. So Stellaris simulates much longer time frames than most other digital games. And it allows players to actually manipulate their time frame. So it allows in the unmodded game a game that runs for 1,000 in-game years. And it's probably also important to say that the actual granularity of that is a single day, right? Players are able to manipulate this progress of time, the speed of the game, so to make that somewhat feasible. And I will come back to exactly that question of how feasible that is at the end of the talk. The game also gives us access to vast spaces, challenging our imagination with a game world where the smallest depicted spatial unit is a whole planet. And it not only allows us to encounter dozens of distinct and diverse intelligent species, but to play as any of them and approximate a first-hand experience of a more than human species intelligence. So the central questions then that I want to ask here is, how does Stellaris work with the conflicting scales of the Anthropocene that Heise has analyzed literary narratives for, and what game elements afford or counteract non-anthropocentric play? And at the end, there will be a little coda on the actual method of analyzing this and the challenges that this study actually encountered, which I think are very telling. To just give you a brief idea of how I set this up, I created a new campaign in Stellaris and set it to the maximum allowed values in the game. So I made the biggest possible galaxy of 1,000 star systems, and every star system has multiples of planets, and many of them habitable, and set it to the longest duration of 1,000 years. And I played for about 50 hours in the last 3 months on this campaign, and spoiler alert, I got about halfway to my goal of 1,000 years. And I will tell you later why. I played the unmodded current version of the game with a range of DLCs. If anybody is interested in that nitty-gritty, I gladly talk about that more, but just for completeness sake, that is how I set this whole project up. To get first the elephant out of the room, of course, Stellaris is a grand strategy game. And as such, it has a lot of ideological and mechanical baggage. It simulates socioeconomic growth, or it has a socioeconomic model that is really based on paradigms of growth and expansion. Remaining small or even practicing degrowth is severely disincentivized by the mechanics of the game. Stellaris is developed by Paradox Games, and they have specialized in grand strategy games, as surely many of you are aware of. And although those games, those are the 5 currently running games right now that they have, although some of them tend more towards war and conflict than others, and some of them really try to go into an individual level to the degree that they border on RPGs, they all share, though, a socioeconomic model that sees conflict over territory and resources as inevitable and as almost always ending in war. Because in the worldview of Paradox, no matter how peaceful one plays and how amicable one's diplomacy is, neighbors will eventually contest one's borders and lay claim to a civilization's territory. Stellaris contains many scripted violent disruptions, usually wars. Even if the player doesn't engage actively in those, these conflicts will just upset the whole order in the galaxy. They will lead to conflicts between allies, to numerous follow-up strife and border disputes, and generally will leave the galaxy in a militarized state. And the player, even if they try to play completely peaceful, will not be completely able to pull themselves out of these conflicts. And even where the Paradox games don't venture into outright war, they see political interaction as also always characterized by conflict. So relatively early in the game, the different civilizations in the galaxy will come together and form a galactic council, and this galactic council can, of course, have majority decisions. And these majority decisions can then have, can exert a lot of pressure on individual nations and civilizations. For example, ask them to change their ways, to depart from old traditions. And in those situations, the player is then confronted with either disgruntling their own population, forcing them to change away from their old ways, which of course leads to internal unrest, or to defy the galactic community, risking heavy sanctions. And in many cases, if the player tries to arrive at a compromise, they will experience both. Yes. That unified sociopolitical model of all paradox games is also visible in the unequivocally anthropocentric concepts of history that they share. So even in Stellaris, just like in the other games, so in a game that's set in a galaxy full of fundamentally different species, every civilization has similar individual development of the individual citizens. They all have a similar lifespan, they all reach maturity at a similar time, and they all retire at about the same time. And also whole societies develop after the same human pattern. So every species goes through their industrialization, develops a combustion engine, develops nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and only then starts spacefaring. But all of that being said, so all of that out of the way, yes, it has these problems. Stellaris still holds an enormous potential for articulating the challenges of scale that Hajo discusses. And I would go actually so far as to say that Stellaris is fundamentally a game about scale. That is already visible when you start a new campaign. So of course, Stellaris offers you some quick start, pre-made civilizations to play in, but it also allows you to create your own civilization from scratch. And that starts by selecting a species. Stellaris has 14 archetypes for species that are fundamentally different already, and which then can be customized along 100 different traits. So for this experiment, I chose to create a race of communal-minded conservationists, floating, tentacled, asexual fungoids. And I auto-generated the name, and the name is the Obevni. You see a little bit here in Obevni floating in its natural environment. As the next step, players then choose one of 50 origins for their civilization. A lot of those origins are tied to particular species. For example, if you play a robotic civilization, you can, for example, have overthrown your organic creators. The game also contains a lot of origins that have an eco-critical dimension. I chose one of those for the experiment, where the species has developed on a planet with absolutely ideal conditions for it, to the degree that the species really knows it will not thrive in a different environment and will have a hard time finding a replacement home. Because, I mean, that's kind of also similar to our situation. Next, players select up to 3 out of 16 governing ethics. They select a form of government and specialize that even more in a number of granular civics that articulate principles of everyday life. So my Obevni that I created for the experiment, they are pacifists, they are radically egalitarian, and they are governed by a direct democracy which adheres to civics of environmentalism and a universal basic income. I think you see a trend here of what I kind of try to create. Finally, the player chooses the scope of the simulated world, which means the number of planets, the shape of the galaxy, the number of other civilizations at the start of the game, how many of them will be aggressive and collaborative, and of course also ultimately the time frame of the game. And the standard game would have 600 stars and run for 300 years. And as I said, I tried to max that out and go to the values of 1,000 stars for 1,000 years. The irony of me being a German and going for 1,000-year reign, it only dawned on me this morning, and I deeply apologize for that. Just as a little footnote, there are mods out there that promise to go to ludicrous scopes for the game. So there is one that actually allows you to have a galaxy of 50,000 stars, which I don't think any computer can run. So I've gone into a bit of detail here with the game setup to show that with a custom game of Stellaris, already before starting a new campaign, scale, diversity, and alterity are foregrounded qualities of the game. And more importantly, within the timescales of the Anthropocene that Hajo emphasizes, it becomes clear that Stellaris operates centrally on the medium level, on species-wide agency and a species-wide scope. In actual gameplay then, Heise's three conflicting scales are very much entangled in both mechanics and narrative elements. The smaller scales are initially more tangible, of course, not the least because of the comparatively small beginnings of a civilization at the start of a campaign. I begin this particular campaign with 1 planet, 5 spaceships, and only the most fundamental knowledge of the surroundings. The early game emphasizes how small a whole planet and a whole species are on the galactic scale by operating with a very strong fog of war that we cannot really penetrate for the longest time, which essentially puts the rest of the galaxy not on the horizon but beyond it. To this effect, Stellaris employs a number of really interesting ludonarrative strategies that resemble the poetic devices that Heise discovers in her analyses of science fiction narratives. Mirroring the fog of war of the game space, the intellectual development within the game is similarly characterized by obscurity and absence. Although research and development are arguably even more important for Stellaris than for other strategy games, it does not visualize its technology tree. What you see here is a little excerpt from the tech tree of the game. You can really not see it. The full tech tree is there on the side, but it's not contained in the game. That is the result of theory crafting that the community does. So there are 400 technologies in Stellaris that are all staggered with each other, and everything is prerequisites for other technologies, and the game chooses to not visualize this, which again is a small but very powerful move that signals to us that we're not meant to understand, that we're not meant to be able to just have an overview. We need to work hard to that, and we are put into our place. Just as another footnote, just this morning, my social media feed delivered me a community challenge to identify which technology is a prerequisite for which other technology. So the community is now actually making quizzes out of that. The level of individual-driven history is present in Stellaris through its leaders, the politicians, researchers, and generals, as well as through its political system. The leaders have human-level lifespans, as I already said, during which they acquire a number of positive and negative perks as a result of the kind of work they're doing. These perks provide impactful bonuses or disadvantages, which means that while no individual leader ever makes or breaks the development of a civilization, they very well leave their mark for better or worse. And their retirement is usually something that is not just a narrative event, but is something that you feel on the mechanical level as well, because suddenly you do no longer have a 5% boost to morale that they had provided before, something along those lines. The game abstracts the rest of a civilization into factions, essentially political parties, if you will, that express ethical positions and interests of parts of the society. And that renders disparities and injustices visible on a political level. Very much abstracted, but it still models this. Inter-individual justice is then modeled through systems such as civic rights, which can be egalitarian or discriminatory, and that's up to the player. In my experiment, you probably guessed that already, I had the Obevni develop into an open-minded, pluralist society of peacefully coexisting species with a diverse political landscape. Some of the neighboring states are fascist warmongers and ultra-capitalist slavers, and the game allows all of that also to its players. The level of acting as a species is most visible early on in Stellaris through first contact with other species. This is modeled as a very complicated process, often requiring years of research and diplomacy to establish even the most basic communication. And there is no individual that really takes credit or responsibility for the success or failure. It's the whole species and their civilizations that begin to develop communication and relationships with each other. This timescale then is taken to its extremes by the so-called fallen empires, immensely old civilizations that players will encounter in the galaxy whose inception is lost in time and whose infrastructures have been declining for centuries. In this particular playthrough of the game, one of my immediate neighbors was such a fallen empire, the Cormathanian Ancients. Despite their decline, their power is nearly incomprehensibly large when compared to a fledgling civilization of the early game. and you really can't make this out. What I'm showing here is simply the game's score screen that you can access at any given point, and it pretty much does an accumulated score of the different strengths and weaknesses of a society and normalizes that to a certain level. In this scoring system, this ancient civilization is a full 100 times more powerful than my starting civilization at the beginning of the game when I encountered them. The geological timescale then, finally, the third one, is in Stellaris presented in various ways. But they all need to compress it or otherwise reconfigure it in ways to make it more palpable for human players. One of the ambitious technologies that all civilizations in the galaxy eventually get to is terraforming, which, again, in an interesting twist that the game has, can not only be used to forcefully make a planet more habitable for an invasive species, but also to repair damage done to ecosystems by its own inhabitants. But there are also individual events that express geological time as observable events, like when the player witnesses a neighboring civilization suffering through the tectonic collapse of their home planet and the cataclysmic effect this has for their whole civilization. The game there actually even insinuates, although never confirms, that the activities of that civilization might have influenced their planet's fate. So we're coming again back to the idea that acting as a species has unforeseeable and unmeasurable, unknowable consequences potentially. Events like that aren't the exception in Stellaris, but a constant, expressed in the presence of the already mentioned fallen empires, in encounters with spaceborne life forms in the depths of space, and the frequent discovery of archaeological sites that bear witness to lost civilizations that lived eons ago. While allowing the player to take countless meaningful actions, Stellaris always reminds the player that even if they are guiding the efforts of a whole species, they are engaging with processes that are beyond their comprehension and even more so beyond their control. And now you would see a very elegant juxtaposition, like a progression through the game state, and could see on the scoreboard how the Obevni slowly rise to power, because through playing the game for in-game centuries, the Obevni become a peaceful center of the galaxy and end up actually even in the internal game scoring system, surpassing the Cormathanian ancients in power. So after 400 years, my species of peaceful isolationists has become the most powerful force in the game. And I'm not saying that to make a point for this as a power fantasy or as a brag for my gamer creds or whatever. Why I'm emphasizing this is because it's somewhat surprising that a war-focused grand strategy game like Stellaris actually allows me to be so successful with a decidedly peaceful and environmentalist approach. Research options in the game often arise that allow distinct climate action, and some leaders that you can recruit actually can forcefully advocate for ecological policies on the galactic level. There, in this screenshot, there is one diplomat who gets a 100% bonus because they speak so passionately for climate change. As the pinnacle of this development of the peaceful and sustainability-focused development of the Obevni, they eventually permanently overcome energy shortages by building a Dyson sphere that harnesses all the energy of the sun and thus provides a power source strong enough to supply their whole civilization and actually half the galaxy without any negative side effects. It's of course difficult to demonstrate the scale of Stellaris without getting bogged down in excruciating detail, which I might already have now. But I hope that this still illustrates how overwhelmingly complex the game is and how it really goes out of its way to address these different levels of experience that Heise sees as crucial for our understanding of the Anthropocene and how we interact with our natural environment. The last detail that I want to touch on before wrapping up are the methodological reflections that this all prompted for me. Stellaris supports playing a campaign of 1,000 in-game years, right? It wouldn't otherwise, I didn't mod the game. It let me do this, but it's not balanced or optimized for this. 400 years into that 1,000-year run, I exhausted the technology tree and all the traditions, meaning that peaceful development was now at an end. The civilization naturally plateaus. There is nothing more to do. And the only thing for me to actually then do was to wait for an emergency, most likely a war, that would require my attention. So while the whole game conditions you essentially to go out and try to uncover the whole of the universe, at the end, you are anxiously trying to keep a grip on it and monitor it in its entirety, turning this dynamic around. This change goes hand in hand with an issue that has plagued Stellaris since its launch. Its endgame slowdown, not in terms of mechanics or player actions, but in terms of pure processing time. Because logically, as the game progresses, all civilizations grow in population, number of starships, colonized planets, trading routes, political relationships, and so on. Simultaneously, the player gets, through diplomacy, research, or other means, more of an overview of the galaxy, which simply leads to the game having to compute and render increasingly and exponentially more elements for the player. The latest version of the game, that's why I was emphasizing that, version 4.3 actually went through a fundamental refactoring where Paradox reduced the number of units in the game by a factor of 10 to address this, because they wanted to make that kind of this approach playable. Still, when playing the game beyond its normal length, the slowdown is very significant. And after 500 years, I was observing the whole galaxy with its tens of thousands of units at less than half the speed that it had at the beginning. And it became sort of increasingly questionable if I even could approach the end game, if it would be possible to play it for 1,000 years. So, to come to my conclusions, observations. So I played for 50 hours and only managed to play for 500 in-game years, half as much as I had set out to do. I had exhausted the majority of the content of the game, and through Steam achievements, could see that the way that I was playing was far from average, which made it very difficult for me to generalize from my experience to the average player. The achievement I got there is, just a sec. The achievement I got there is called Peacekeeper, and it's an achievement for playing 200 years without engaging in a war, and 1.6% of players have it. So I love doing these experiments because they rack up these ultra rare achievements. But you get my point, right? I would love to say that the great potential that the game has is something that a lot of players partake in. This would seem to indicate the opposite. Still, I would still argue that this tension or even failure of concluding the experiment and seeing that it's not representative for other players is still productive. Because it raises the question of how do we study games that give us a taste of the scale of the Anthropocene, when despite the many shortcuts and simplifications even Stellaris takes, it's still almost impossible to even experience this time scale. Is this attempt of simulating a semblance to the concurrence of conflicting timescales of the Anthropocene maybe as good as it gets when trying to actually experience them? So Heise concluded that she found, and I quote again, stories of large-scale change and forces influenced by and yet not controlled by humans, stories about the emergence and demise of communities that relate in different ways to the planet's changing ecology. And I would say that I definitely also can attest to Stellaris. But even more, I can now see that the addition of interactivity and large-scale simulation has a lot of positive effects. However, it cannot overcome the need for compressing the geological time frame. That is still so incredibly large that it needs to be modeled in a different way for us to even have it included in a game like this. So still, Stellaris adds to the qualities found in the literary texts that Heise analyzed the ability to offer first-hand experiences of more than human species and to experience the conflicting scales of the Anthropocene from a different perspective thus, calling attention to the limitations of our own view, if nothing else. And I think I managed to show that Stellaris indeed forces us to correlate individual history, species power, and deep time to some degree at least. And that without a raised index finger, without an explicit moral it pushes on us, or any other form of pressure. And, maybe that's worth something. Thank you very much.